Hello and welcome. This is going to be the first in a series of 4 or maybe 5 videos reviewing every book that's newly been prescribed in the New South Wales HSC syllabus. So this was a document released a few months ago or a few weeks ago, and it outlines the texts that are available for teachers to teach in the final assessable year of Year 12 in New South Wales for the various different levels of English. And English is a compulsory subject in New South Wales, so all students across the state will have to study some of these texts in some shape or form or pattern, and I just thought it would be interesting to talk about them, to set myself a challenge of reading all of them, which I'm almost done with, and reflect on what this really means for the teaching of English and teaching of literature, and just the relationship between literature and people in our country right now. So a few caveats before we start with this. I'm going to break this into the different types of modules that you can do, and I'll briefly explain each one, but I do not work for NESA, and I am not a current working high school teacher. I did study English teaching at university, and so I do know a bit about what I'm talking about, but nothing I'm saying here is prescriptive or designed to give advice to teachers or students or anything like that. It's just my reflections. I'm just some guy on the internet. But hopefully, having read through these books and talking a bit about them, it might be an interesting capsule of what English teaching looked like for this period of time. And if there are English teachers out there that find certain texts to work better for students, hopefully that these reflections will be of assistance to them. That's all I'm doing this for. It's just a little fun thing that I thought I would do because I have a strange sense of what is fun. One final caveat too is that everything can work, and everything can work in a certain purpose and context. Every text that has been selected here is very clearly done for a particular purpose, and nothing is a bad choice. Whilst I do think that some are going to be more difficult or more specific than others, and I'll point that out, I don't think anything will not work, and to the point that I think you could just randomly select texts and it would be fine, I think that's fairly true. I think there's no real bad choices here. A lot of the time, these choices are made out of the control of lots of different people. We're not still entirely sure about how these choices were made by NESA, right? They're just books that are on a list, and now we have to abide by them. So we got to make the best of what we can do. I'm just trying to speak as positively as I can. I do think that the teaching and learning of English should be a fun thing. It should be enjoyable, and I think that storytelling is always going to be an enjoyable thing. So hopefully these texts will be meaningful to people in some way or another. And just some overall thoughts on the winners and losers of this round of prescriptions. I think it's interesting because it's been a while since we've had a change of text. It's been, I think, about 8 years because it's been disrupted by COVID. So there are some texts in the current set of prescriptions that are set to expire in 2026 that have been there for a very long time. I will be honest, from my experience in tutoring, there are some texts that are extremely sick of teaching because they've just kind of been squeezed completely dry. So I am glad of a lot of these changes, but I'm also aware of the strain that places on schools and teachers to have to change these texts, have to buy new texts and develop new programs. It's not something that should be taken lightly, and it's going to be a lot of labor. And so I do want to try and reiterate to everyone watching, please be kind to teachers. This is going to be such a big task to do. And whilst some of that task will be fun, it will also just be a lot of extra admin stuff on top of ordinary teaching. I know that from experience, and I know that because I'm not a teacher anymore. The winners of this new set of prescriptions are by far Australian texts. I find it so fascinating that the Common Core Text and Human Experiences, which is mandatory for all standard and advanced students, is entirely Australian text. And so this forces every student doing either standard or advanced to have to do an Australian text. And I like the way that it does reflect a really wide image of what Australian fiction can look like. That being said, I'm not entirely happy with this choice because Text and Human Experiences ideally is such a wide module that gives so many different ways of expression. Australian fiction is fine. Like I'm getting from a lot of the teachers I'm talking to that Australian fiction is often not the pinnacle of writing from a international or world standpoint. We're just not really a literary country. And I feel comfortable saying that because compared to countries that are known for their literary output, whether it is novels or plays or films or whichever that have really rich and storied histories of publishing and storytelling, Australia just doesn't have that same sense of history. And it's not an insult to the country or our culture to say that. It's just kind of my reflection as first a Chinese person, which is a very, very literary culture, coming to Australia where our public knowledge and appreciation of literature is just a little bit different. Like, we like stories and we like storytelling, but we don't have that titanic influence that something like the UK or USA or France or China or Japan or lots of other countries have. And focusing on Australian literature, there's going to be that kind of feeling where we're limiting ourselves to a smaller pool. Another big winner is short texts. So all the novels that are available in the 2-unit subjects, so advanced and standard and English as an additional language or dialect, are really short. We're talking mostly novellas or novels that are shorter than 80,000 words. So going into a bookstore, it would be towards the shorter 30 to 40% of books. There's not a single book outside of extension that's more than 80,000 words, which is an interesting choice. I don't dislike it because I think it actually helps teachers and students a lot. It gives a much larger chance that students will be able to finish their work in year 12, which can be so busy, and it also allows lesson planning to be a bit easier because there's less reading material to do and there's less planning that needs to be done for all the different aspects of a text. I definitely found it much easier for myself to finish reading all of these, whereas if it was the previous list of prescriptions, I absolutely wouldn't. There's just so many big texts in there that it would take me so long to get through, whereas these texts for this round are mostly just small samplers and it's not too difficult to get them. Lastly, a big winner here is poetry. So poetry is once again mandatory for standard and advanced. It used to be for this current round of prescriptions that poetry or drama was a text that could be selected, and I understood the logic behind that is that poetry and drama are both kind of medium-based, focused forms of writing that are quite different to novels. So there are some schools that chose not to teach poetry at all and just chose a drama text like The Crucible, whereas most schools I've found still taught a poet. But now poetry is mandatory, you have to do a poet, and all the poets that they've selected that I've read so far have been excellent. So there are no duds here. They're all really good collections of poetry. Some are much, much more challenging than others, but I feel like the choice of poems to study and the choice of collections to study is quite insightful this time around. I really enjoyed reading a lot of the poems on this list. The losers. So, feels bad for me to say this. There are some categories of texts that are just not doing as well in this round of prescriptions. They just haven't gotten quite as much love as poetry have. So the losers are big, long novels. There are none. Another loser is, unfortunately, theatre and drama. There are not many plays on prescription, and the ones that are there tend to be ones that are returning from previous years. There isn't a lot of representation of new drama, and now that drama and Shakespearean drama for advance have been combined, I just don't think many students are going to do plays outside of extension or outside of drama as a subject. It's a bit unfortunate because I find that teaching theatrical text can be so fun and so practical and so hands-on, and that's just not really something that this set of texts enables or allows for. Drama has now been moved to drama, non-fiction, and multimedia and film. Again, the connections make sense to me, but there's not as much freedom that's available to teachers who definitely want to do a theatre text. Another loser is film, unfortunately. Second prescriptions in a row. The film choices are not that varied. There's one film available in each of the prescriptions, and there tend to be very specific types of films. Most of the ones prescribed are quite slow-paced. They're art house, which is nice, but they're not really enjoyable films that can get a class really cheering and, get them discussing. It's more films that are personal, introspective experiences that are a bit quiet and slow-paced. And I do feel like for the teacher who loves film, they're going to need to make an argument for why this particular film was chosen. Okay, so that is overall. We will now go into Text and Human Experiences, which is the module coming between Standard and Advanced. This is the one that the most students in the state are going to be doing as part of their assessment, and it forms the first paper of their exams. So eventually students will need to write an essay in 45 minutes about one of these texts, and link it to the very broad and wide idea of text and human experiences. So the core conceit of this module is that literature can represent what it means to be human, can make arguments about humanity in an individual and a collective sense, and explores the complexities of humanity. You can never make one defining statement about what it means to be human. There are always going to be exceptions and edge cases and paradoxes and anomalies. It has, to me, been one of the more fun modules to teach, just out of all the modules that I've taught so far in my years of teaching and tutoring, because it's just so rich and complex. There's so much to talk about. Kids, when they're turning 18 in year 12, are interested in this kind of thing. They're interested in what it means to be human. They're starting to develop that sense of awareness and responsibility for themselves, and it's just been really cool. This module, in the current prescriptions, the most popular text by far has been 1984. I've found that around half the students that I've tutored have had this text at their school, and I think it's fine. Like, 1984 is such a monolithic text that it makes sense to require students to read it in high school, but I also think that if it wasn't prescribed, people are just going to read that anyway. You don't really need a school prescription list to force someone to read 1984. It's just going to kind of come up. It's just so salient in our culture. Whilst it's nice to have a space for discussion of this novel, I am a bit tired of it. I'm finding more flaws in this novel than pluses every time I reread it, because it's just getting a bit tiring for me. So I'm very glad to see that moved out. We will start with the novels for Text and Human Experiences. Actually, let me flick up on the screen all the different texts that are available. So for the novels, we have Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica R., which is this very new, modern text that's been released. We have An Imaginary Life by David Malouf, which is a returning text, and we have the short stories of Henry Lawson. For poetry, we have poems from Rosemary Dobson, who was a poet who was working towards the early half of the 20th century. We have poetry of Gwen Harwood, who was a very often prescribed Australian poet, writing towards the mid-late half of the 20th century. And we have poems from Love Poems and Death Threats by Samuel Wagan Watson, which is a 2014 collection from a First Nations Australian poet, and this is just a remarkable collection that I've really enjoyed reading. For our I'm going to be so sad saying this over and over again, but for our conglomerate of film, theatre, non-fiction, and multimedia, we have Question 7 by Richard Flanagan, which is a memoir, non-fiction sort of text reflecting on the author's father's experience in the Japanese prisoner of war camps in World War II, connecting that with the genocide of first Australian people in Tasmania, and the way that nuclear armament has been represented in science fiction and then reality, and how often it's connected to this idea of genocide. It doesn't sound... well, it sounds really heavy, but it has actually been quite an insightful read, so I did enjoy my time with it. For theatre, the only play available is Away by Michael Gow. This is a returning text. It is a very, very old play. It's written in the, I believe, 1970s or 1980s, and it sets in the 1960s. We have characters reflecting on being a veteran of World War II. And it was a contemporaneous play when it was first performed, and it's just been prescribed for decades now. It's fine. It's okay. Lastly, for the film and multimedia, we have One Night the Moon, directed by Rachel Perkins. It is a musical short film kind of thing. It's about 15 minutes long, about a historical situation where a young girl from a farmer's family in rural Australia disappears, and the farmer refuses to let an Aboriginal tracker help to find her. So it's also a musical. It's sung by Paul Kelly. It's an interesting text. It's also been prescribed a few times. We'll talk about each of the texts. The way I will talk about the text is to provide a brief plot and style overview. I will talk about prior knowledge and language that's useful for students to have before reading this, and I'll also give content warnings. So if there are particular topics or ideas that might be contentious among students, I'll try to raise that here. This will not be comprehensive, but I'll try my best to foresee what challenges might occur with teaching a text. I will think about prose of the text, so what might make it a really strong choice, considerations, so things that a teacher might want to work through with their class before starting. None of this is really advice, it's just kind of like my reflections on how I would go about it if I was teaching this text. And hopefully each one will show why it's been chosen and why it can be a worthwhile thing for students to go through. I also will say there's unmarked spoilers from here on. I'm not going to be talking about texts in a roundabout way to try and avoid spoilers. I'm just going to say what they are. There are a number of texts that are structured around hidden information, and I'm just going to ruin them. So I will have timestamps. If there are particular texts that you want to go out and read, then don't watch those ones, of course. First one in the novels list is Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Al. This is published in, I believe, 2022, so quite recently. It's about a mother-daughter relationship of Asian Australian migrants from Hong Kong, and together they go on a holiday to Japan, just the mother and daughter. The daughter is around her late 20s, early 30s, I believe, so old enough that she's got a life going for herself. She lives by herself with her partner, and she feels this obligation towards her mother to try and guide her, take care of her, be a good daughter for her. But this is a somewhat strained relationship because from the very beginning of the novel, we see that these two can't really communicate very well. They don't have a whole lot in common, which is a very common part of the migrant second culture experience. And we see mostly the main character going to museums, going hiking, enjoying this holiday. Very little happens in this book. If I was to break down this book in terms of plot events, it's just a holiday. It just reads like a travelogue. So there's not a whole lot that happens on the surface, but beneath the surface, it is so deep. It has this very intricate relationship between this daughter and her mother that says so much about the way that we treat other human beings, and especially familial connections. How some people may seem like burdens to us one way, and they might seem like blessings to us in another way. It is such a deep and rich book, and a difficult choice for teenagers, I would say. I just feel like this book hit me at a really good point in my life because I'm of a similar age to the narrator, and I could really reflect on my relationship with my family. Whereas if I was 18, I think I probably would just skim over a lot of these moments, and I wouldn't really appreciate the depth behind them. I would just think, wow, this is a lot of description of things that don't really matter. And by page 50, I'd be wondering, well, what's happening in this book? What's the point? What's the complication? What's the plot? And analysis is going to be required to get to that point. It is only 100 pages, and I would say about 30,000 words or so. For a fast reader, they could finish this easily in an afternoon. For a more reluctant reader, it might take them a week or 2 weeks, especially to get over the slowness. But if they have a really robust reading session, it's not hard to finish. I think it would be something that you can expect most of a class to finish, even just in the first few weeks of teaching, which is a huge bonus. I think the difficulty with 1984 is that there were students who would finish the novel before the term started, and some students who would be finishing just about the time that exams were to happen for text and human experiences. So having a shorter novel in this Common Core is a really good bonus. Content warnings for this text, very little. Despite, well, it's about a mother-daughter relationship, and so if there are certain students with issues in a familial context, then this might raise some things, but nothing in this is particularly harrowing or traumatic. There's discussions of things like neglect and things like lost loved ones and the hinting that certain characters might be dead, but none of that is really explicit. And none of it's done in such a way that it will, well, I'm just guessing here, none done in such a way that I think it will really provoke a strong reaction in students. So out of all the texts that are prescribed, I think this one is relatively safe. I do think that it helps to have a contextual knowledge of migration and of East Asian cultures, and especially Japan. I don't think that'll be hard with what a lot of teenagers will be into, but just knowing what it's like to travel to Japan is kind of nice. For the prose, I like that it's short. I like that it's straightforward. It has a lot to talk about. It's very detailed in its representation of human experiences. The language is also both straightforward but also incredibly beautiful. There's lots of nice quotable moments and lots of different uses of varied techniques, but it's also very accessible. So I think this works very well as a text chosen for the purpose of analysis. The drawbacks here is its slow pace and the fact that it might be hard for teenage audiences to empathize with someone who's in their late 20s. I do think it's important for someone to have made decisions that they can't go back on before they can really empathize with characters like this. But I believe in teenagers. I think they can do it. The other thing too is that there's no chapters in this book. It's just one solid run of text, and so it does make lesson planning a little bit harder because you can't really tell where students are up to. You can't really have a discussion of, hey, everybody read chapter 2 and answer this question about the writing there, because it's not broken up that way. So standard activities like sending students into groups to find quotes from certain parts of the text is going to be a bit difficult, and going back into the text myself, trying to figure out exactly where something is pretty tough. It's very woven and very layered, but it feels to me like it's designed to be read in a single sitting. So it makes it a bit harder to plan around that way. Book number 2, An Imaginary Life by David Malouf. I read this as a ebook, so I don't have a copy of it, but it is also quite a short novel. It's an older novel. I believe it was published in the 1960s or 1970s, but it's set in ancient Rome. So the premise of this story is that Ovid, who was a poet in ancient Rome, was banished because of his writings that promoted hedonism and atheism and individuality and distance from the state. And so he became a pariah in the Roman Empire and was exiled from the city. Growing up as a Roman, he had certain expectations of civilization and what it means to be part of back then, the biggest city in the world. Like, imagine someone getting exiled from New York today. That's the kind of feeling that Ovid's going through. He eventually finds himself in a community of tribal or nomadic people, and this is where the novel starts, is that he's trying to relearn what it means to be a human being outside of these civilization structures that has been literally the only way he's been able to exist up until this point. So he's trying to relearn what it means to be a human, to have companions and connections, to have something to believe in, to eat and dress and survive, to defend the city from the barbarians, to make relationships and connections. All of these things that we consider to be core to the human experience, he needs to relearn, and he needs to understand why, first of all, Rome didn't accept what he was trying to say, and now to try and find some kind of acceptance within this community. And the driving plot is that a few, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen pages in, the traveling party meets this wild child who is completely abandoned and has no language and living with wolves, and the protagonist decides to take this child in and to take care of them. In doing so, he needs to reflect even further about what it means to be a human, because even in this nomadic group of people, this tribal group of people, they still have their own culture, they still have their own language and civilization of their own. Ovid needs to try and accept this civilization as one that is legitimate and valid, even as it is so different from Rome. But the child that he finds has no civilization, has no language or connection, and yet is still human, and is still something that's worth taking care of. And so this narrator now is divided between his loyalty to the tribe, who is taking him in, is protecting him, but also has very strong needs for community in order to survive, compared for his compassion to this child who is just so different and vulnerable and alien to everything else that he knows about what it means to be human. And the tribe has certain superstitions about this child that Ovid himself doesn't personally agree with. So it's a novel about individuality and culture. It's a novel about taking care of someone else and being taken care of yourself. It is, honestly, it feels like it's been perfectly made for text and human experiences. There are some lines in this novel that can just be taken straight away and added to an essay, and it's just such a clear assertion of what it means to be a human. It presents all of these different arguments about what humanity is. It just works so well for this module. Prior knowledge and language, knowing a bit about ancient Rome is nice. Knowing a bit about ancient cultures is cool. If someone does ancient history in the class, they'll probably enjoy this a little bit more. The language, I would say, is more difficult than Cold Enough for Snow. So David Malouf is a literary author. He likes to write with a slower pace. He has more challenging vocabulary and more challenging sentence structure. So someone who's not as familiar with particularly literary styles of writing will find this very slow and very hard to read. There were times where after I'd read a page, I had to go back and actually read it again and try to figure out what is it trying to say, because it's not made for mass consumption in the same way that Cold Enough for Snow seems to be trying to approach. So Cold Enough for Snow is very clear and conversational. An Imaginary Life is literary. It's designed, it's constructed. There are more techniques, but it's harder to try and pass the relationship between quotes and technique and effects. But it's there to challenge students if they want to go through that. content warnings. So this is a more dramatic text. There are depictions of violence and of childhood abandonment, various discussions of religion as well. So Ovid talks a lot about atheism, and depending on the school context, that might cause some issues, I guess. Aside from that, nothing is particularly graphic. There is descriptions of animal death, and of course in this tribal environment, their relationship with animals in the natural world is going to be different to anyone living in a city. There are some graphic depictions of killing animals and preparing them for food and things like that, and other various rituals that they believe in to try and exorcise demons in the child. There are moments of violence that to me were a little bit shocking, but nothing so dramatic that I think a 17 or an 18-year-old reader would be particularly turned off by. Yeah, like it's more intense, but it's not too far, I would say. For the prose, so I think this is a really good text to write an essay about. After reading it, I immediately wanted to start writing an essay because it just quotes so easily and so neatly. It's so easy to find examples that meet a particular point about human experiences, but it's also got a lot of depth and richness. If students want to dig more deeply into ideas of character and setting and perspective, they can do that. It's also nicely divided into chapters, and unlike Call Enough for Snow, which is just very everyday, this novel does have a core plot structure. It has a character who wants a thing and is faced with trials and eventually makes a decision. It does flow a little bit better. For our cons, it is longer. It is, I think, it is definitely the longest text of the prose fiction novels in Text and Human Experiences, and the writing style is not accessible. It's not something that will be similar to students who are just passing readers who are reading popular fiction. It does take a bit of work to try and get used to the style of writing here. It's also, I think it's kind of boring. I do think that while it's such a great text to write an essay about, it's not a fun text. And from what I've heard from teachers reading it, it can be a bit of a slog. For students that really want an engaging story, this is not going to be that for them. It will probably feel like work. It will probably feel laborious. So my suggestion would be more towards students who are focused on exams and focused on marks and really want a text that will give them something that they can write about. Because this is very easy to look at a text for analysis. But for a text for enjoyment, a text for reading, for the pleasure of reading, this is not it. Lastly, for prose fiction, we have short stories by Henry Lawson. There are 5 stories prescribed, which is The Drover's Wife, The Union Buries His Dead, Shooting the Moon, Our Pipes, and The Loaded Dog. Together, these stories are about 10,000 words, so by far the shortest of the prose fiction texts. Henry Lawson is this iconic Australian writer who was working in the 1800s. His style of writing is for entertainment. He was writing just tall tales for people out there in regional Australia to try and share their experience and to try and really glorify this frontier sort of lifestyle that Australians then they would have called them pioneers. Now we look at them slightly differently, but it's really glorifying this drover lifestyle, talking about how beautiful the landscape is and how powerful and meaningful it is to make your own way in this unforgiving landscape, but at the same time amping up just how difficult it is to live in these kinds of environments, how often it's a battle between man and nature or man and the distance from another human being, that we find connections in unlikely places, and we are often trying to define ourselves based on our success in terms of agriculture or success in terms of relationships. So it's looking at these everyday sorts of moments that happen with people in regional Australia. I feel like most students will be to an extent familiar with who Henry Lawson is. He's such an iconic Australian writer. I feel like is he on the Australian banknote, or is that Banjo Patterson? He's known, right? He's a known name. But the actual experience of reading these stories is mixed. So the language is not extremely inaccessible because Lawson's writing just for average people in his time period. He's not using very difficult constructions, but it is archaic language, and he does use dialect, Australian accent dialect, when he's writing dialogue. I do find more difficult, though, is the narrative structure of a short story just hasn't become very robust in this historical period of time. Not all of these stories are particularly engaging, and there are some stories that made me wonder, well, what's really the point of this? They don't have that really expected plot structure that we want from a modern short story. By far the best story in this collection is The Drover's Wife. This is a really varied story about a drover's wife taking care of their children and trying to instill good values in them, but also a very lonely story of being in this farmstead and of being very responsible for the safety of her children and also the farmstead when it's so easily threatened by everything, by bushfires and weathers and by snakes. The drover's wife is in this position where she's just responsible for it. And it's a really triumphant story showing the lengths of which Australian women had to go through in this colonial time. The other story is a bit more mixed. So The Union Buries His Dead is about someone who dies in a river, and a group of, like, a labour union doesn't really know who he is or what he means, but they try to go through the motions of a proper funeral anyway. Shooting the Moon and Our Pipes are from the perspective of the same character, and they're mostly conversational stories about things that happen to this character, again reflecting on death and culture as well. And The Loaded Dog, the last story, is this screwball comedy about two people who try to fish with dynamite, and their dog picks up the dynamite and gets it stolen by a bigger bully dog, and the dog explodes. I don't really know what The Loaded Dog has to do with human experiences, but the rest of the stories do have a fair connection to it. Prior knowledge and language, I would say of the three texts, this is probably the toughest to read. I think if students have a bit of familiarity with that historical, rural language, depending on what they've been taught in previous years, then it might be doable, but it is definitely not the vernacular language of our everyday, and it's not going to be like the average book that students will be reading. It's very historic language. I also think that having visited these kinds of natural environments can be really beneficial. I think that a lot of students in Sydney might have never been to regional Australia to see what the farmland is like, the pastures are like, to see what that harsh natural environment is like, and it makes it harder to empathize with these characters in this environment. Content warnings, it's a very colonial mindset, and whilst there aren't, I think there are offhand mentions to First Nations Australian characters, and it's not in a particularly good light, and some discussions should definitely be had in class about that colonial mindset that existed in the past and what about it is relevant today. There is also a dog dies via explosion, and it's played as a joke, so that's there. So for prose, I think that because this is such an iconic Australian text, it does have a place in our cultural national myth. And so it's not very hard to find resources about this text, and students may be engaged to read this text knowing that it's a part of our national history. I'm just theorizing here. I don't think any of the students personally that I've taught would feel this way, but I'm just theorizing maybe it's possible, right? And it's also the shortest of all the texts, so for students who just want the minimum amount of reading, this is the minimum. I think that Cold Enough Snow is easier than this because it's easier to read, even though it's longer, but to make the cell of this the smallest word count text in all of Texting Experiences of Post Fiction, yeah, it's short. I like the way that the stories are divided, so having different stories for different purposes allows students to write in a more varied way for their essay. They can choose the stories that they find meaningful, and they can quote from that. Stronger students can also synthesize ideas from across different stories and make an argument that way. For cons, these are boring. I'm going to be honest, I didn't enjoy reading these. I only enjoy them as a historical lens to think about the kinds of people that would have enjoyed these kinds of stories in their heyday, but reading them in 2025, they're just not that interesting. They're just not well-paced, not very clear. The Drover's Wife is the exception to this because it does have a good narrative arc, it does have good characterization and meaningful dialogue, and it does have characters that I really feel for. The other stories, I'm just kind of like, take it or leave it. They're historical curios. They're not something that anyone's going to be going out of their way to read today. Henry Lawson, as much as he is a figure that we can revere and respect as Australian storytellers, he is not someone that we're going out of our way to read. And The Loaded Dog, I don't really know how I'm ever going to link that to human experiences. Like, a bunch of larrikin fishermen give a stick of dynamite to a dog, and it gets in a fight with another dog and explodes. Like, what does that really have to say about the human experience? I would just have a hard time making an argument for that. Because it is short stories and it's named short stories, I do think that it's possible that the exam can specify a certain story to write about, so they might say in your response refer to the drover's wife in addition to other stories in the text. And so students will need to be prepared to write about each of them. I don't think it's going to be very hard to do because some of these stories are 1,000 words long. They're very short. If students have a few quotes from each story, then it's pretty doable. I just think that if the loaded dog was chosen, I would just be confused. I don't think very many students or teachers or schools will take this option. I think it's just a bit of an odd choice, and it doesn't have that really tight connection to the rubric of text and human experiences that the other two texts here have. Moving on to poetry, the first poetry text is collected poems from Rosemary Dobson. There are 7 poems in this collection: Young Girl at a Window, Summer's End, Cock Crow, A Fine Thing, Child of Our Time, Piltdown Man, and Every Man His Own Sculptor. 7 very varied poems from a Australian poet who I think is iconic, but I'm not sure how many people know of her work, but she is an excellent writer, and all these poems are fantastic. They are really varied as well, and they approach humanity from such different ways. I enjoyed reading these so much. So Rosemary Dobson's collection is returning from the previous Text and Human Experiences rubric. There are 3 poems that remain, so Young Girl at a Window, Summer's End, and Cock Crow are from the old prescriptions, and the other ones have been rotated out, and instead we get these next 4. These poems are variously available online. There used to be a Australian poetry resource that had a huge collection of various Australian poets, and all of these poems are available from there. It's unfortunately gone down, but it's available on Wayback Machine, which is how I got these poems. They're really good. I really enjoy them. Their language is really simple, and so many of these look at what it's like to be young and what it's like to look out at the world and to have all these different decisions about what's good about life, what you want to do, what you want to be, who you are. I think that's answering some questions that teenagers will really be asking at this point in their life. And of all the poems that can be picked, these have simple language and simple meaning. Like, I don't think there's a single poem in here where after you read it a single time, you're confused about what the meaning is. And yet, it's all very quotable. There are lots of different techniques here that vary between different poems. Some are more structured, some have rhymes and meters, some are more imagistic, and some have lovely descriptions of spring days and afternoons. It's just a great collection. I think it's such a strong choice, and I was surprised that Rosemary Dobson was not very popular in Text and Human Experiences, the previous iteration. I hope this is going to be popular in this current iteration. It just works. Prior knowledge and language, pretty much nothing. The language here is really simple and accessible. Content warnings, also pretty much nothing. I think it's just very clean and clear. There's not really a lot of tragedy here. Prose, I've said it before and I said it again, these are delightful poems. They're so enjoyable. Like, here's an excerpt from A Fine Thing. A fine thing to be a snowman, lost all day in deep thought, with a head full of snowflakes, no trouble at all, with an old pipe and 6 buttons and sometimes children and woolen gaiters, but mostly lonely, a simple fellow with no troubles at all. Like, that's just delightful. Like, you just feel good reading that. And I think starting the year, or starting year 12 in Text and Human Experiences, with a text that's so easy to understand and so bright and hopeful and effervescent is just a nice thing to do. I know that students just will not like poetry in any circumstance, but I hope they'll like this. Like, I just want to be bright and optimistic and share these fun poems that explore what it means to be growing up and deciding your place in the world. It's just nice. It's just a good set of texts. For cons, I wonder if there's an argument to be made that these are not dense or complex enough for very high ability students. I guess some students might think that are a bit trite, but I think there's enough. Like, this is definitely the easiest collection of the 3 poets set for study here. I think it's good enough, but I wonder if there are going to be students who want more of a challenge. All the poetry texts, there's that risk of a particular poem being prescribed, and because the poems in this collection are so different, students will need to be ready to write about each of them. But I don't think it'll be that hard. I think that these poems are easy to remember. They're just enjoyable. Each one has such a different style, and they're all very knowable by their title as well. Will it be hard to quote from? I also don't think so. But I guess maybe those like high order techniques, like if some students really want to write about techniques that other students have never even heard of, you might not find them here. But that, to me, is not a big con. Like, I think this is a very good choice. Moving on to collected poems from Gwen Harwood. Gwen Harwood is such a infamously prescribed Australian poet. Even from the very beginning of studying English at university, we were just constantly exposed to her poetry because she is a very clear Australian voice. And I wonder if she would even be so famous if it wasn't for how often she's prescribed. She's prescribed all the time. I'm so familiar with students who have studied her poetry at some point, and I get it. Like, I understand why the poems align well to Australian teaching sensibilities. They're very much entangled in the Australian landscape. They're very personal, they're very reflective and everyday, and they're not controversial, which can't be said of a lot of Australian poets from the 60s and 70s and 80s who were quite transgressive, and I didn't know they even existed until having a conversation with Australian poets as part of my writing practice, that a lot of these poets in the 60s were writing about very transgressive political things, and Gwen Harwood, writing the same period, is a bit more personal and a bit more safe. And so it makes more sense why she's been prescribed. The poems on this collection are changed from the past, so there are a few that are really common. The first four, The Glass Jar, the Violets, At Mornington, and Father and Child Part 1 and 2, I've seen taught in various different contexts. They're fairly old poems, but the next three are from newer collections, and they're actually not in this book that I have. I had to go to the library and get a more recent collection to get them. That's A Valediction, Beyond Metaphor, and The Sharpness of Death. It's a bit annoying because they're not available online, so you do have to get the collected poems of Gwen Harwood in order to access these poems, and they're a bit interesting for their choice. I'll talk about that in a moment. Prior knowledge and language. So Gwen Harwood is such a personal writer that she will integrate things that she's interested in, including specific references to geographical formations in her hometown in Brisbane or in Queensland. And so students might find it a bit hard to empathize with that. For a poem like At Mornington, no one in New South Wales is going to have like an image of where Mornington is, right? We're going to need to Google what that place is, what it looks like. There's lots of cultural references to things like classical music and classical poetry too. A Valediction is a response to Valediction Forbidden Morning by John Donne. The Violet references Scarlatti, the opera singer. They're just things that students aren't really going to get. And so it's going to result in this teaching style where the teacher is responsible for explaining a lot of these intricate references or getting the students to Google what the words mean. And it just is a different relationship between the reader and the poetry when the poet has all the information. The poet has this bag of information, and the students are begging for what the poem means. It's so different from Rosemary Dobson, which is immediately accessible. Gwen Harwood's poetry does require a bit of work. As for content warnings, weirdly enough, some of the poems described explicitly are about sex. The Glass Jar is about a child walking in on their parents in the act of sex. It's not graphic, but that is what the poem is about. It's about the loss of innocence. And it's impossible to analyze this poem without a discussion of the narrative of it, and it just results possibly in an awkward moment with students. In the same sense, The Sharpness of Death is about sexual experience in a way. Like, it's not entirely about that, and it's not graphic, but it's also impossible to analyze the poem to its entirety without having a discussion of how the language used is sexually charged. So students should hopefully be mature enough to do that in Year 12, but that's something to be careful of in case there is a class that's not ready for something like that. For our prose, now this is a more complex set of poetry, and for students who have that relationship with poetry where they want to try and work it out, where they need something tough to try and figure out the true meaning behind it, these are rewarding poems. I think that the language being used here is effective and meaningful. They do get better with analysis, so knowing what choices are made in each particular line and really digging deep into the word choice and the grammar and the structure can be quite rewarding. And students who like poetry, the rest students who like poetry, might enjoy these for how deep and complex they are. They are also narrative poems as well, and they're really vivid. they're longer as well. Most poems are about 2 pages or so. So they do give lots of opportunities to quote different things and to discuss and compare, to find evidence across different poems, and for really advanced students to synthesize different poetic devices and to make connections across all these poems from different parts of her career. I think that they're really deep and rich. For cons, I don't know if students will find this engaging. This to me is like peak English teaching, where it's a text written by someone in the Middle Age that would be meaningful to someone in the Middle Age, and we are requesting students access that. We're requesting students to access the meaning of a text that has really not much relevance to them. There are some texts that are about childhood, but even then they're about reflections on childhood. They're not about being a child or being a teenager. So it can be a bit harder thematically to try and get this across to students. I just foresee a lot of students disliking these poems. The students I've talked to that have done Harwood at school, very few of them have liked it. They tend to find her poetry a bit hard to access because of all the various cultural references, and it's when they get to the end, the themes and the meanings just aren't relevant to them yet. I think it's a rich and rewarding text, but maybe not one that will be well liked. Lastly, Samuel Wagan Watson poems from Love Poems and Death Threats. This one is really hard to find. It's a poetry collection from 2014. It contains that poem Boomerangs in a Thunderstorm that was used in a reading paper a few years back, and I would love to not be cynical here and say there is a clear reason why this is the collection that's been chosen, but I'm not going to theorize anything beyond that. So the poems selected are The Remedy of Butterflies, Finn, Let's Talk, El Diablo Highway, Black Tracker, Black Rider, Black Subject, End of Days, and Addendum. Samuel Wagan Watson is a First Nations writer, and he is a very contemporary poet. So if people are seeking a collection of poetry that's going to most accurately reflect what poetry is like today, if someone was to pick up a poetry book that is published this year, or someone was to attend a poetry reading or a poetry event, they will encounter poems like this. So this is a really current text, and I really appreciate the way they've chosen it. I also like how overtly political a lot of these texts are. The person choosing the poems has really not shied away from poems that are very real and very relevant to concepts like First Nations self-determination and capitalism, consumerism, and political decisions made as well. I just think that it's very daring. In this collection, there are poems that are more about nature and are more apolitical, and those aren't the ones that have been chosen. Instead, we get poems like El Diablo Highway, which is about the way that consumerist political agendas are driving people towards effectively hell, El Diablo. We have poems like Black Tracker, Black Rider, Black Subject, which is about the nature of being a First Nations writer and the way that different people and political organizations look at your work as a commodity. We have poems like Finn, which is looking at the way the Brisbane River has changed shape because of climate change. It's really, really current. And I think for students who are politically switched on, they might find a lot to enjoy from these poems, both in terms of what they're trying to say, but also the stylistic experimentation that's going on here. Some of these are prose poems, a lot of these are using different registers of language. There are some poems that are written in formal tone and some poems that are written with colloquialisms. It's enjoyable, it's really current, and it's really urgent in a way that the other two collections of poems just aren't. It's poetry for today, and I really, really like that this is an option here. For prior knowledge and language, some knowledge of national policy towards First Nation issues is good, and I think that's still part of the compulsory teaching in Year 9 and 10 history, so hopefully students who have listened well in those lessons will be aware of issues that Wagan Watson raises in these poems. It also includes a lot of Australianisms and references to Queensland geography, so it's not as hard to get into as something like Harwood, but there will be some Googling required to figure out certain references, certain intertextual allusions. There's a reference to Huckleberry Finn in Finn as well. It's not immediately accessible, but with some research and some collaboration, I think that students can get to the meaning of these poems independently without having a teacher explain, here is what this line means, and that's what that line means. For content warnings, there are some somewhat extreme depictions here. There is discussion of, I guess, what we could say political or contentious issues, and that may result in some fairly spirited discussions in the classroom or at home if parents are very eager to talk to their students about what kinds of texts they're doing. It could lead to some interesting conversations, but it is something that will open up that debate. It is absolutely not an apolitical text, so that's something to be careful of. For our prose, I just think that this is such an accurate representation of what poetry is like today, and if students, I'm being very hopeful here, but if students want to read poetry outside of school, if they want to be writing their own poetry, if they want to be attending poetry events, or to look at this medium more than what they're doing at school, this is probably the pick out of the three, because it's such a good and varied representation of different poetic forms today. I think it's pretty challenging because it's so experimental. It's going to show students things that they're not used to seeing of poetry. Like, if you show them Rosemary Dobson, they're going to say, yeah, that's poetry. But if you show them a prose poem from this collection, they will be challenged. They'll be confused. They'll wonder why it feels like poetry and yet it's different. And there's this whole ongoing conversation about what poetry is and what poetry should be that can be had with this text that I think is a really good thing. For our cons, so I guess those political considerations are there, and I do have to mention it's a very hard book to find. I had to go to the state library and request this. It's not a book that will be easily found in bookstores or in local libraries because it's poetry, and poetry is just not very respected in this country. If the school is required to buy copies for every student, it's just going to be a hard thing to do. I do think this is a really, really good choice, and I do like that there's a First Nations text in Text and Human Experiences that is easy to pick, that teachers can just elect, and it will fit really nicely into their program. Lastly, we'll talk about multimedia. So there are 3 multimedia texts available, 1 for each text type. This makes me a little bit sad. Question 7 is an interesting book, and I will say I'm not really someone who reads nonfiction very much, so I can't say a lot about if this is conventional, but it feels unconventional to me. It feels varied and non-linear, and it's about so many different things. It's hard to say that it's just a biography, and it's hard to say it's just a history text. It's a hybrid text. It's a discursive text. The core metaphors of question 7, the power of literature to try and explore human things. So it works out this rubric, of course, but question 7 is from a Anton Chekhov quote or letter where he's making fun of how mathematics and science can't explore the human heart. The question is, I think, train A leaves the station at this time at this speed, train B leaves this station at this speed, who loves longer after loss, the man or the woman, right? Like that kind of absurd question of how can you answer this with science? You have to answer this with literature. And so he's exploring the ways that science and literature interact with the invention of the atom bomb as a core example. He looks at a book by H.G. Wells, which predicts this massively destructive explosive device that's really small, and in that book he compares it to War of the Worlds as well, which makes reference to the genocide of First Australians in Tasmania, how one class of humanity with such a powerful weapon can just completely eradicate another to the point that one is a statistic. He refers to his own upbringing in Tasmania and the potential that there is some First Nations lineage in his family, but how difficult it is to find that information just because of how powerfully one human being can destroy and erase another in our current climate with nuclear armament and war and all of these bad things. So it's complex. And he also reflects on the fact that whilst the bomb is depicted in so many different ways in film, in Dr. Strangelove, in Duck and Cover, his own father was a prisoner of war in Japan, and after surviving the Death Railroad and surviving the prisoner camps in Japan, he was released after the end of the war, after the dropping of the atomic bombs, and so the author reflects on how possibly the only reason why he exists is because these weapons were used. And so it becomes a very conflicted story about war and identity and existence, about how human beings can treat one another, and how we might be able to remedy the problem of one death as a tragedy, a million deaths as a statistic by using literature, and he tries to structure this book in a way that will make people feel the ramifications of all the death that happened in World War II. It's not a particularly fun read. It's a very heavy read, but it's told in this conversational style. It has storytelling kinds of moments where the narrator or the author is reflecting on their journey to Japan to try and interview people, and he's talking to people directly that would have been guards in this prisoner of war camp and may have actually had interactions with his father. And he's talking about this particular Japanese sensibility of avoiding the past, or like trying to not say the controversial thing. It's complicated. There's a lot going on. It's a pretty long book. It's about 90,000 words, I would say. And for students who aren't as familiar with history and nonfiction, it may come off as a bit boring. I will say it's probably the least boring of all the nonfiction books for a teenager's perspective. It's got references to World War II, it's got references to growing up as well, it's got lots of themes that are relevant to being a teenager, and it's got lots of quotes that are meaningful for text and human experience as well. It does require quite a bit of prior knowledge to know about the Pacific Theatre in World War II, to know about H.G. Wells and who he was, and to know about the Tasmanian genocide. A lot of this is explained, but not detailed in a way. So having that head knowledge is going to be better for students to then access the more emotional side of this book. For content, now this is a book about World War II, and particularly about Japan's involvement in World War II. Most migrant students aren't going to be very connected to this, but it is a really contentious topic for older generations of Chinese, Korean, Malaysian, Singaporean, like anybody who was affected by Imperial Japan. It can be quite a contentious topic. The genocide of First Nations people in Tasmania as well is a truly horrific thing, and it's something that will need to be discussed while looking at this text. In lighter terms too, the descriptions of East Asian people in Japan by the narrator is not great. Like, there are a few, I would say, mildly racist phrases that I think will just have to be glossed over. I didn't like it, of course, but it's fine. It is what it is. It doesn't stop me from thinking this book is a great choice, but it is something that I think students will make fun of. So that's something that as caveat. Prose, I think thematically this book is really complex. It approaches lots of different things, humanity from an individual side and as a collective side, and of the moral conflicts that arise from ending a war but also killing a lot of people, and how that has been a recurring event in human history. I think there's a lot to be learned here, and it's a very edifying book. For our cons, it's nonfiction, and nonfiction is always going to be a hard sell. I think some students will find it a bit uninteresting, and it's a slow start. It takes a while before it reveals that it's really a book about nuclear armament, and up until that point, I think students will have trouble reading this. I think it's just not got the same sense of pacing or plots that a modern novel is going to have. If students are not used to reading nonfiction, then this will be a bit of a hard sell. For the drama text, Away by Makugao, this is I believe a one-act play. It's fairly short, and it's about a summer vacation in the 1960s where three families of different social classes gather together and are mixed up together by this big storm, kind of like the Tempest. In fact, it refers to the Tempest directly, and people are confronted with their own prejudices and beliefs in this growing and changing Australia, where people are changing social classes, people are being affected by things that are relevant to what was then modern life, like debt and credits, like the economic forces of the time, like migration, like war trauma from World War II and later on Vietnam. So, is it relevant today? It's relevant in that it's a historical document. It's not going to be very relevant to our students today. I think the world is just so different compared to this view of Australia. This book, this play, is presenting that kind of ochre vernacular Australia of the 1960s that's kind of just a joke today. Like, it's just not something that students are going to connect to, which is difficult because it feels like it's being written as an honest depiction of an average Australian family of the time. So for people viewing the play at its first and original performance, they would have seen themselves on stage in a way that hadn't been seen before. There aren't a lot of plays about just ordinary Australian life prior to this movement of theatre. So the meaning that it has is now different. The meaning that it has completely changed. Instead, you'd have to read this play as a historical document, as how playwrights and authors were feeling in this part of history, and to really go over context and to explain why people cared so much about these things. It just makes it a bit more of a difficult text to teach, I feel like. So prior knowledge so much about what it was like to live in Australia in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the kinds of things that people were worried about. I guess for some teachers who have lived in Australia for a long time, this context is lived, and so it's probably a bit easier to teach. But as someone who comes from a migrant background and who, I guess, relatively younger, this text is older than I am, I have a really hard time accessing it. The language as well is very Australian vernacular in a way that's kind of different to our current vernacular. So some phrases may need to be explained if students aren't as familiar or aware of it. Content warnings. There is a child who dies from terminal illness or suffers for the entire play from terminal illness. If that is something happening in a school climate, that will be a difficult conversation to have because it is very structurally here. There are also characters in here who are deeply unlikable, and I just think that if we're trying to teach students to be empathetic, to be people who listen to others, who see the world from others' perspectives, and who are ultimately kind and nice to one another, some of the depictions early in the text of some characters are just cruel. They're just things that are caricatures and are designed to make people hate them. And I get that they have their retribution or they have their transformation towards the end of the text, but this play is so short that the transformation doesn't feel earned or labored over. It's just that this woman, who's by all means a horrible, judgmental person from the very beginning, and just spends all this time picking on others and criticizing others and tearing people down, and then she experiences a conversation with one person that makes her realize that, hey, maybe life isn't just about showing off your achievements, and then by the end, she's fine. Like, to me, that's just not deep enough. To me, that's just, we're dunking on this character for most of this play, and then finally they get a small change. I just didn't feel that emotional change as much as I wanted. For our prose, so in a conversation about what Australian culture is, it's hard to ignore the world that's produced by this text. And I think that it is accurately presenting what Australia might have looked like in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and to understand who we are as a country today, it's worthwhile to have a knowledge of what this period of time was like. So as a historical record, I think this play is fairly meaningful and valuable. It's lighthearted and it's very easy to understand. The characters are varied, so there are a few different characters from a few different walks of life, some men and some women, different people with different speaking styles and aspirations and goals, that I think doing a read-along of this in class is probably very achievable. We have different people who can be different characters and inhabit these lives, and that could be a more meaningful form of instruction than just reading a novel or reading the play by yourself. I wish I knew if there were modern productions of this play or film adaptations or filmed performances of this play that were fun to watch as well, because I think so much of this play relies on the sound of the language. The way that people talk with different accents is going to be really significant. For our cons, I just think it's a bit of a hard play to relate to. The themes and values are really far removed from what students are going to be experiencing today, and when students are put in that position of having to be confronted with that, I think the default reaction is to make fun of it. I think that students will just not get it, not enjoy it, struggle through it. It's also, to me, my experience of theatre, it's not an extremely theatrical text. There's not a lot of stage direction or planning here. Because it is a bit dreamlike, I think there's a lot of space left for a director to have their own vision of it. So the script doesn't work incredibly well as a text to be read by itself. It is much more a script that's an instruction for actors and directors to put on a performance, and the performance is the full text, not the experience of reading the script. I think to study drama, you would need to watch this. I feel like I'm limited here because I didn't experience a performance of this text. a performance of this text might really transform the way that I think and feel about it. Another con too is that there's just a lot of quite harrowing content here. There's discussions of terminal illnesses and PTSD, of children that have been lost in the war, mothers who have lost children, lost siblings, things that can be really heavy. It can go one way or another. It could make students think that every text we do in English is just really deep and heavy and sad, or it can go the other way and students can just start making fun of it. Neither of them are particularly good. And I just don't see many visions of a class finishing this play and everybody just loving it. I think there are going to be some considerations to be had about studying this text for analysis, but not necessarily for enjoyment. And our last one, the film for text and human experiences, One Night the Moon, directed by Rachel Perkins and starring Paul Kelly. This is a musical historical film about a family in regional Australia who loses their child, and because of the father's racial prejudices against Aboriginal Australians, refuses to let a First Nations tracker on his land, resulting in the death of their child. And it's a musical. It's a weird text, and I get that it's respected in Australian culture, and I get that it's really emotionally powerful. I just don't feel like it's made for classroom instruction. And it's so interesting to read reviews of this film, because there will be people who have watched it and gotten the full emotional experience and love it, and there will be people who have studied at school and give it 1 star, and they say things like, I cheered when the main character killed himself at the end. You know, it's just like, the effect of the film is completely lost on teaching it in a class format because of just how unusual it is. The story is really emotional, and the songs are really well composed. I think the lyrics themselves have a lot to say about Australian attitudes towards frontier life and towards First Nations people, and towards trying to rationalize what a colonist would have thought about his land and how he possesses it and how he finds identity in controlling it, and how the wildness of the land effectively becomes an adversary to the colonist versus a First Nations person who has deep personal lived knowledge of this environment, and so they identify with the land in a way the colonist doesn't. There are songs that speak to this, and they are really deep and rich in the lyrics, to the point that just one line to me feels so emblematic of this conflict. And yet we need a lot of prior knowledge, because I think the issue is there's not a lot of dialogue outside of the songs. So if a student knows what the racial dynamics are between First Nations people and colonists around the 1900s, then they will understand why there's conflict there. But the film itself doesn't show why characters are prejudiced against one another. They just say that they are prejudiced against one another. We don't really get to feel the prejudice faced by Albert, the First Nations tracker, because the film is just really short. It's not... I feel like it just needs more time to breathe. It needs more scenes where the characters just live their life in the wake of these societal constraints before we get to this core narrative of the daughter is missing and we need to go find her. We need to see what the world is like for each of them, and we need to know why the prejudice is there. Because if a student is trying to access this text and they don't already have preconceived notions about prejudice in Australian contexts, the film is not going to teach them that. The film just presents it. So they're going to have a much more limited emotional experience of the film than someone who already knows the injustices faced by First Nations Australians. For our content warnings, so we do have the loss of a child, we have racial prejudice as well, and we have the not depicted but very, very heavily implied suicide of a character at the end. We have depictions of depression in the opening scenes. It's quite a dark film thematically. Just to describe the story of it to someone else is really heavy. And yet the experience of watching it, because it's a musical and because Perkins uses this, to me it's a kind of Baz Luhrmann style directorial style, where it's really garish. There's big camera movements and superimpositions and fades and just really overt filmmaking. And because it's a musical, I just don't feel that sad. Like, there's moments that are sad, but the entirety of the film could have been a lot more grim, and it isn't. And I don't know if I like that, because the subject matter is so heavy, and yet the presentation of it doesn't mirror how heavy the emotions are. That's just my view of it. I still like the film, but I do have these criticisms of it. As for prose, I like the songs. I think the songs are catchy. Because there are songs, it makes it easier to quote, because if you know the song lyrics and you sing them in your head, then you know what the quote's going to be. So it's easier to remember in that sense. It's a really short film. It's about 50 minutes long, so it's not very difficult to get through with a class. It's just like one period of film watching, and then you go straight into analysis. It is, I think, of all the text here, the one that can be finished the fastest. So if there is some kind of disruption in the term, it can be done without much loss to the students. It's also something that is readily available. Students can watch this in their own time. They can watch it again to try and get their quotes if they want. As for cons, I just think it can backfire so much, because students who don't get or don't access or don't like the text can make fun of it so easily, and it's already so obvious from previous times this is prescribed, of students complaining about it, commenting about it, making snarky comments. It can be a real battle between the teacher and the student to talk about why this film is poignant and not something that's just an object of derision, which makes me very unhappy as someone thinking about the prospect of having to teach this. I also think that the style of this film is a bit outdated now. It was made in the early 2000s, in a time when Australian filmmaking just didn't really have much budget, and it looks really dated today. It looks really low budget today, because I imagine most students and most people are going to be used to this really slick Netflix style of film production where everything is just so well lit and so well organized. One Night at the Moon feels like, I mean, it was filmed over a few weeks. It's just not the same degree of filmmaking. It's valuable for what it is, but students who aren't familiar with that style or don't respect that style will find that a barrier to enjoyment of the text. I also think that outside of these songs, there's just not a lot of quotation material. The characters don't really speak to one another. There's one or two phrases that are required for moving the plot along, but I wish there was just a conversation. I wish the characters talked to one another and expressed what their views and feelings are. There's a moment where the mother of the lost child goes to Albert the tracker and tries to appeal to him and ask him, "Will you do this for me?" And it's done through looks. I wish they just had a conversation about what each of them felt. But that's not the film that they went out to make. That's the film that this is. And that makes it a very difficult film for study for that reason. Like, it really doesn't feel like a film that was made to be studied in a high school classroom. So I'm apprehensive of this one. Okay, that was a bit too slow, but that's all 9 texts that are available in Text and New Experiences. Each of them I like for various reasons, and each of them I have reservations of for various reasons. I think all of them are viable, of course. Each choice allows for different considerations in different modules, and as I go through the standard video and the advanced video, I will talk through programming in different ways that different texts might synchronize well with one another or clash with one another. But overall, I like them. I think as an image of Australian storytelling, we're doing the best that we can. Are there texts that I wish were on here? Yes, but looking at the desire of keeping the list relatively small and keeping it to short texts, I think we have a pretty good representation of different styles of writing here. There are different authors of different backgrounds, of different purposes. Each one reflects on human experiences a different way. Each one of these can work. Each of them connect to the rubric in their own way pretty well. So I'm hopeful, I'm hopeful.